Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So, I thought we would start with a thought from the book of Isaiah. I just captured this on my iPhone. It's not as pretty as some of the pictures I get up there, but it's a thought that I focus on. In Isaiah, he's a prophet in the Old Testament. He's writing about creation. And in the chapter 40, we sometimes can learn a lot from creation, because as we study creation, we find our place in life, in the order of things. If we don't take that time to ponder it, sometimes we feel our problems are bigger than life. And we feel our fears and anxieties overwhelm us because we don't have the right perspective. And it's not to be insignificant, but that perspective, I think, is a good reminder of what we were created to be. And that is essential for good health. Mental health is something that is not just unique to people who have issues with mental health. We all struggle with mental health to stay normal, because we all go through periods of grief, we all go through periods of disappointment, and those can be episodes that can take us down a long time. They don't have to be just in someone who has schizophrenia or bipolar. We all struggle with fears of the unknown. And this perspective, I think, is healing and healthy for good health. It keeps us from drowning our sorrow and our fears with the wrong things. Like food is often used as a drug to cheer us up, to comfort us, because we don't want to just leave those feelings of fear and anxiety unattended. And so here's a perspective that I think is healthy, that puts us in perspective of our vast creation. And if you've never seen the vast array of stars out there, look through the eyes of an astronomer who can give you pictures and can describe the pictures in terms that can just open your mind up. And that's kind of what the prophet here in Isaiah is doing in chapter 40. He says, "Lift up your eyes on high and see who has created these things, who brings out their host by number. He calls them all by name." To me, just calling something by name, it seems insignificant. But when you realize that there are more stars in the universe than there are sand on the beaches of our world, it's a huge amount of stars out there. And each one of them, God gives a name. And to me, that's significant. When you name something, that means you know who it is, and you show ownership. He owns everything he made, and so he names it. By the greatness of his might and the strength of his power, not one is missing. To balance the creative forces, you can't just randomly throw stuff out and expect it to have order. That would be a sandbox in disarray. To have the vast powers of physics interplaying and keeping it all in order, it takes some planning. You have to know how heavy everything is and where to place it for it to spin just the right way so that it keeps spinning in its order. Come on in. And here's the second thought that kind of leads from the first. So we know that God names the big galaxies, he names the worlds and the stars. And now he says, "Fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by your name. You are mine." He doesn't just name the planets and the stars, he names each of us. And we received our name before we were ever created, because he knew ahead of time what he was going to do. He's that smart. And so, if he gives us a name, our life and our health, it matters to him. Our disappointments, our struggles matter to him. He wouldn't name us if we were so insignificant. And so, this here doesn't talk about millions of years to be created in the absence of a creative force. It talks about God being a creator. He named us. And so this idea of getting rid of God by letting evolution be the God of this world denies the existence of the need for God. And what it does is it denies the need of the human soul for a higher power. And if you look at society, you can see how it has destroyed the fabric of our society, because without a God in our society, we lose the direction of why this country was started. And so some people lose their sense of peace and direction in their life by missing this perspective. And I think every so often we need this reminder of our importance. And it can help you get a healthy perspective. So instead of focusing on the fears, we focus on the higher power that can get us through today. Any thoughts on that? Okay. Well, let's have an opening prayer. Gracious Father, it's a privilege to come before you to know that you are much greater than our thoughts. You have powers way beyond our understanding. And if you can create the worlds and keep them in order, you can keep our life in order, and you can provide the health through the understanding of science and how our bodies were created. We appreciate all your blessings today. Give us understanding of what we're studying today. We pray in the mighty name of Jesus. Amen. Okay. So the handout we started a few weeks ago, we were talking about this big word called alkylphenol disruptors. And we kind of followed through how these certain chemicals are in our environment. These chemicals are very small amounts. And so you think, well, who cares if they're so small? The problem is that they get concentrated. We call that biomagnification, where something absorbs the toxin. Let's say it's a frog in a pond. It can absorb the toxin through its skin. And then an animal eats the frog, and then another animal eats that, and so on up the food chain. And if we eventually eat that bigger animal, we don't just get the toxins that the frog was exposed to, but the hundreds of frogs that animal ate. Because these toxins, these alkylphenols, they end up being concentrated in the fat of the animal. So it's not just one meal that they were exposed to in the pond, but kind of the additive effect. And so we see their significance is much bigger than these tiny, tiny, small amounts that are in our environment because of this biomagnification principle. And so fortunately, when you eat a plant-based diet, you're not eating a high-fat diet. And since this process, this biomagnification, happens through carnivores, animals that eat animals. Plants in general don't do that, at least not the ones we eat. And so we don't see this biomagnification problem in that respect. So it doesn't take rocket science then to figure out how to avoid alkylphenols. And for those who may not have been here for that lecture, the alkylphenols, they interrupt our immune system. And they were making a case that it affects allergies in particular. They noticed in Japan, they had a much higher incidence of this exposure, and their seasonal allergies went up in a dramatic way in just, I think they said 10 years. Something that changes in the course of just one generation cannot be genetic. We always like to think, oh, this disease, that disease was caused by our bad genes. We inherited that weakness. But if the same people are living there generation after generation, and we see a new change, it wasn't a mutation in the genetics that caused this. So that they don't have to worry about that if it's a brand new thing in an environment like Japan. So they realized there must have been some exposure, either to some new drugs that are being prescribed, some new foods that are introduced. If all those things are the same, then you would say, well, then there's some new toxin in the environment that they have to find out and study. And so that's that's why these are just the ones we have studied and understood. Let me get this on the video. So today, so that's kind of the background for today's discussion, which you have in front of you. It's called Dietary Sources of Alkylphenol Endocrine Disruptors. So if you know what foods have this problem, chemical, then you can be more intelligent when you buy things to avoid eating those foods as often or as much. And so by understanding the general principles of where these chemicals come from and how they get concentrated, you don't really have to finish the article to figure out, well, if you eat just foods that come from the fields, that weren't carnivores, you would probably avoid exposing yourself to these alkylphenols. And as a result, you would have a lower problem with seasonal allergies. And it's not just allergies. You think, okay, who cares? Twice a year, when there's pollen, you suffer through some allergies. But it's bigger than that, because you don't just have allergies, you have more problems with all the similar diseases. If you have allergies, you're more likely to get asthma, you're more likely to get eczema. Those are skin diseases. Certain kinds of dermatitis. So it's not just for a 2-week thing. Some people suffer from eczema their whole life. And that's month after month. It's not just like when the pollen comes out. So let me start this video up, and we'll learn a little bit about which foods to avoid. So when we follow this, if you can think of some, let's say there was DDT in the environment. It's a different name chemical, but same idea. These are similar chemicals that concentrate in the fat of animals. So we're avoiding exposure to even unknown, unstudied toxins that could get amplified and magnified in our food chain. And so it's just a healthier principle to avoid these foods.
And being an animal ourselves, our fat would store the same toxins.
Yes.
So that's...
And if we were to be eaten by other animals, they would concentrate those toxins when they eat our fat. So that biomagnification principle keeps on concentrating these toxins.
I'm curious, once it's stored in fat, how toxic is it to the host, or is that a healthy way to store your toxins? I mean, and then once you lose weight, and then you're exposed to these things.
What you bring up is a good point. You think, well, so what? They're stored. Who cares? Well, people go through spells where you're ill. Let's say you have pneumonia, and for a week or two, you don't eat as much as usual, so you lose 10 pounds. It's not a huge difference, but now you've lost some of those fat stores. And so your blood now is releasing, or the fat cells release these toxins into the bloodstream during that illness. And that actually happened and wiped out a whole school of seals a few years back around Los Angeles. They had all these seals dying off on the seashore, and they couldn't figure out why they were dying off. And apparently they had a shortage of food because of El Nino. The food supply was lower. But these seals didn't die of starvation. They weren't like skin and bones. So then they realized that they had consumed some toxins in certain algae, and maybe not directly, but eating the fish that ate the algae. And so that was in their fat. And then when they couldn't eat like usual, they were losing some weight. All of a sudden those toxins flooded their body, their bloodstream. And they all died from that more rapid toxin exposure. Instead of just eating at slow amounts every meal, they all of a sudden got a bigger exposure, and it was lethal to them.
So, time of illness, you're double whammied by the outside and then your inside toxins.
Right. So weight loss can have not just the stress of why are you losing weight because of the illness causing it, but it can have this double whammy, like we're describing, of the added toxins to deal with at the time of some illness that's leading to weight loss. Go ahead.
Is there something we could consume that can go through and pick up those toxins in the process of losing weight? That can absorb them to get them out faster?
Well, he didn't talk about that here, but on a related issue, let's say a toxin like lead has built up in our bones. How are you going to get rid of that? Well, you could go to the doctor and they could prescribe for you a course of medicine that chelates it, but the medicines also have side effects. And so on another article he talked about actually eating garlic was just as effective as this medicine that a doctor would use to treat lead poisoning.
How
And
much garlic?
2 cloves a day. This wasn't a ridiculous, huge
Yeah,
tub full
I
of
was
garlic.
wondering about that. I mean, I love garlic, but
Yeah. And so if you eat the garlic, you don't want it to be overly cooked. Like if you fry the garlic, some of those properties are lost.
steam it.
So you could steam it or saute it, but so most of it is still intact. So that's just another. So these herbs are healthy medicines. Garlic has antibacterial properties as well. So there's many reasons why consuming garlic is not an option. If you want good health, include that in your recipes.
Had mine this morning.
Excellent. All right.
We can all tell.
Yeah, I know, I was gonna say, you can attest to that.
I must have had it, 'cause I don't.
Okay,
All right.
I couldn't let that one go by.
thank you. It's true, I just decided not to worry.
So I'm just going to rewind this, and this is his article on, so we talked kind of, I gave you the backstory of why these chemicals are not good for us. Now we can find out how to avoid them, which foods have more of them in there.
There are many classes of endocrine disrupting industrial pollutants. A concern about the alkylphenols surfaced decades ago when a group at Tufts observed an excessive proliferation of human breast cancer cells in certain types of plastic containers, something you'd normally only see if the cells were exposed to some type of estrogen. They identified an alkylphenol as the culprit, leaching from the plastic, causing the estrogen-like properties when tested in the human breast tumor cells.
So I sometimes stop this because some of you don't hear so quickly. And he goes kind of quick, even I have to review it for myself. What he just said was they do these experiments many years ago. They discovered that they were putting some cancer cells. What are cancer cells? Well, those are special cells that have taken from people usually at surgery. They've taken them into a petri dish. They keep them alive by giving them the chemicals that cells need to live. And the reason they don't die like normal human cells is because they're cancerous. They have figured out how to become immortal. So normally cells die in a short time. But these cancer cells have mutations that make them immortal. And so they can keep them alive in a dish and study them. Generation after generation, they stay alive. All you have to do is feed them. And so they noticed that these cells divide quicker. In other words, they grow faster because they carefully have ways to monitor and count. And they want to know if something's getting sick, that means it'll grow slower or die. So they always count how many is growing in there. And so in these special plastic containers, these tumor cells that came from the breast, they were growing much faster. Now, we know that the breast cancer cells are different than other cancer cells. They show receptors for estrogen on the surface of these cells. So anything that acts like estrogen in our environment will make these cells grow faster. So they figured out that the containers themselves were the source of these chemicals. And so they assume when they grow things that it should be in, we don't always think of plastic having that ability to leach out stuff, but this is how they discovered things like a bisphenol A, BPA. is one of those chemicals that has estrogen-like properties. Now, to put it in perspective, these are very weak chemicals. They're not as strong as estrogen, but they can be measured, and they do stimulate those receptors. We were, a few months ago, we talked about a hormone they use. I'm trying to remember the name. They put it in the beef industry, into cattle. It starts with N. Anyway, this hormone has estrogen properties, and it's like 100,000 times stronger than PPA. And all cattle that's finished for market gets this hormone. So if the farmer injects it a little too soon before slaughter, then some of that would, of course, still be in the meat. It doesn't break down that quickly. And so sometimes people worry about BPA, but there's other chemicals in our food that are more concentrated and more ubiquitous, but we don't always think about that. And these are the hormones that we talk about in the food supply. And if you happen to be having cancer and didn't know it, eating those foods or exposing yourself to those plastics could increase the hormone levels in your body. Now, there might be times where those BPA, let's say, has a weak effect. But if you are, let's say, before puberty, your body is more sensitive to those weak levels. And after menopause, you're more sensitive. Why? Because your body is making very little estrogen in those periods of time. And so any estrogen source in proportion is now going to be more noticed than when your body is making a normal amount. Then the amounts in the environment play a much smaller role if you're already having the normal estrogen levels in your body as a female. So that's kind of the big picture of what he was trying to describe here, of these cancer cells growing quicker than they should because of the chemicals in the plastic dishes that they were growing in.
Countries in Europe started banning and restricting uses of these chemicals, but the US EPA has been slow to respond. 500,000 tons of these chemicals continue to be spewed out into the environment every year. So much so now that they just come down in the rain and then accumulate up the food chain. I talked about the seasonal algae epidemic in Japan. Where in the Japanese food supply can you find these potentially algae-exacerbating endocrine disruptors? Predominantly chicken, and especially fish. Water animals and birds concentrate these compounds to levels several thousands of times greater than those in the environment because these are fat-soluble chemicals. Therefore, they can easily contaminate foods of animal origin, which are thought to represent the most important source of human exposure to many organic pollutants, not just the alkylphenols. This group also found fish was the worst. Which type of fish? Anchovies and mackerel were the worst in this study, and salmon and cod in this study. In fact, salmon was the only food found contaminated with nonylphenol diethoxylate, which is even more potent than regular nonylphenol. And levels of contamination in fish were just the kind of concentrations that start to make breast cancer cells go crazy in vitro. These findings are consistent with the fact that seafood consumption has been associated with severe asthma, current and severe rhinoconjunctivitis, which is like seasonal pollen allergies, and current and severe eczema, an allergic type disease of the skin, in adolescent populations around the globe. If these synthetic xenoestrogens are playing a role, what about natural phytoestrogens, like in soy foods? Turns out that in patients with asthma, consumption of a diet with moderate to high levels of soy phytoestrogens is associated with better lung function and better asthma control. So, if anything, it's more these chemical pollutants which come down the rain, contaminate the plants, the soil, but then concentrate up the food chain in the fat of animals. And
So some people avoid soy because they hear someone say that soy products have estrogen-like properties. And so then they lump it in the same thinking that, oh, BPA has estrogen-like properties, this alkylphenol has those properties, And we don't want to stimulate cancer cells that have estrogen receptors on them, so we'll just avoid eating soy. Well, that's where a little knowledge is dangerous. You have to understand the bigger picture, and even doctors and scientists, if they don't understand the big picture, will sometimes publish this misleading information in various books and pamphlets. Even though soy estrogens do have those connections, they don't cause the same effect when you study the soy products in a population. You can understand the process like, first there are different variations of receptors. They don't all behave equally. And so if you stimulate only one set of receptors and not the other, it doesn't always have the same effect. So it's not always black and white. There's nuances as to how can soy estrogen be different than these environmental estrogens. Just having a chemical that sticks to the receptor doesn't mean it's going to now stimulate that receptor molecule. It just might stick in there and tie up the receptor, keeping the natural estrogens from now affecting it. So in a sense, you can have soy estrogens that block the usual activity that these estrogens in our body would normally have, because they can tie up an estrogen receptor.
Those soybeans, why wouldn't the other beans have some of the same properties, or do they, and it's just
I haven't heard
smaller?
other beans to
Yeah.
be in this category. So they call these phytoestrogens. Phyto means plant. And so he used another term, xenoestrogens. Xeno means it comes from another species. So it's not something that our body made. So these phytoestrogens overall are not bad. Some people think of them as something to be avoided, as if they would make you more like a woman if you eat an excess of soy foods, and that has not been shown to be the case. We see high consumption in Asian countries, and their men don't turn into women because of it. And they don't actually have higher cancer rates in those countries where they consume high soy amounts. So just because something has soy properties, I don't want you to start jumping to the conclusion that, oh, I've been diagnosed with cancer, or it runs in my family, so I can't eat those foods. We don't see that, and sometimes you get misleading information from these books at the checkout stand.
So you're better off tossing the Tupperware than the soy. Yeah.
That's a good way to summarize it. All right, so here they're in a nutshell describing, over here's a factory producing these low levels of chemicals that have estrogen-like properties. It rains down, spreads out. It might be in our corn and our wheat, but it's at such small amounts, it doesn't get magnified. It doesn't get concentrated. But what if you have a cow then that eats it all day long, and it stores it in the fat? Now the cow can concentrate those toxins much more than if you ate the grass or whatever the cow's eating directly. So that's the general principle of biomagnification. If you eat the plant, you don't have to worry. Even if it's like radioactive toxins, like at Fukushima, you're going to get way less by eating the plants than by eating the animals that eat the plants. Because certain of those radioactive chemicals, they get concentrated in the food.
But grass doesn't taste very good.
Well, you gotta juice it.
Neither does kale, but we eat it.
Grass is a stand-in for any plant.
Yeah.
I know.
So some people don't want to go out into their garden and think, okay, there's radioactive cesium or some other chemical landing on my garden. I can't eat it because it's raining down and it's going to kill me. Well, it turns out that low-level toxins actually are healthy for us. If you completely remove all toxins from your environment, like cosmic rays, low-level background toxins, we actually live a shorter life. And they've showed that over and over in different animal and plant and tissue cultures. So the usual net effect is all these low-level toxins stimulate our immune system to fight infection and disease.
Mhm.
And it does that at the bacterial level, it does it at the human cell level. And so I add that thought so that people don't get so anxious about their food, thinking, oh, all this pesticide residue, all this raining, contaminating my garden, you know, they eat it in great fear. And radiologists in general live longer than the average person, and they attribute it to low levels of radiation exposure.
Huh.
Well, you're allowed to have so many rads a year in radiation. But so the chemicals that they put on the fertilizer, chemicals that they put on the vegetables in the store aren't as harmful unless some animal eats it and then you eat that animal.
Right.
In other words, that's what we're saying. So going organic isn't always the best thing to do.
Well,
That's,
in general, if you don't know what's on your food, at least with
It's not
our,
gonna hurt you.
it's not going to hurt you. It might hurt your pocketbook a little, but I haven't seen great studies to show that it's adding so many years to your life by eating organic foods. That subject hasn't been studied in those kind of details.
Well, the only thing is eating organic food, you don't know what little microorganism you're eating in the process.
So true.
You have to
to our benefit.
So,
make good.
on a related thought, if you knew what was on your food, you would be so anxious about peeling your food and getting rid of all of that. There are low-level toxins on the surface of our food, and they are carcinogenic. And these are the toxins I'm talking about, low levels. At those low levels, our body actually stimulated to have a healthier immune system. If the EPA was to have to stamp their approval on foods that come from our garden, many of these foods would be banned. Like peanuts would be banned because the mold that grows on the peanut shell, aflatoxin, is a strong cancer-causing agent. And so that's just a small example. There are numerous foods in low-level toxins at amounts that are just as harmful